Welcome to our discussion on R2v3. Today we're going to be talking about core requirement number 4. And without any more ado, I'm going to go ahead and jump in because this is a long requirement. And Maya and Mike are going to kind of clarify what the requirement says. So, core requirement 4 is the legal and other requirements section. The general principle is to comply with all applicable environmental, health, safety, and data security legal requirements, and only import and export electronic equipment, components, and materials in full compliance with all applicable importing, transit, and exporting countries' laws. So what do you guys think? Like, expand on that a little.
I mean, this is very similar to Provision 3 in 2013. I mean, it's saying the same exact thing. So I don't think in this first portion here, in regards to A, B, and C, that there's a lot of new requirements. It might be worded slightly differently, but it's really capturing what it said in 2013.
Okay. So let's dive into subsection A. An R2 facility shall develop a legal compliance plan to maintain full compliance with all environmental, health, safety, and data security legal and other requirements applicable to its operations, as well as full compliance with all applicable import and export laws covering shipments of electronic equipment, components, and materials. This plan shall be included as a section of its EHSMS. So again, it's similar, right?
Yeah, it's very similar. You have to have a compliance plan. You should deal with what are the environmental health and safety, what's the EPA, what's the fire department, stormwater, OSHA, state-specific OSHA or state-specific EPA or other specific stormwater or other requirements that are applicable to your facility, as well as data security, like whether or not HIPAA, other Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, and other data security acts apply to what you're doing at your operation, as well as any other state laws that are applicable for data security, and other requirements to which you subscribe. So are you a NAID member? Are you a ISRI member? Do you have other requirements from your customers that are applicable to your operation? And you need to be able to track import and export shipments for those that are made indirectly as well. So, I mean, that's important to note, because you need to track focused materials to end of life. Whether or not it goes to a R2 recycler next, you still need to ensure that you have somewhere documented in your compliance plan how that shipment is legal.
Okay. Okay, good. Anything to add, Mike?
No. It's just the only thing is that right now here, instead of, and other, they actually specifically say data security as well. So, but other than that, I think Mike covers it really good.
Okay, great. Okay, so subsection B talks about facility compliance. The plan shall identify and document the environmental, health, safety, and data security legal requirements that cover the R2 facility's operations, both at the facility and all associated off-site locations where activities within the scope of certification are occurring, and define the controls, competence, and monitoring activities to maintain full compliance.
So the only portion, so I really talked about all the facility compliance when I talked about Section A, but the kind of new things here are talking about the operations both at the facility and all associated off-site locations where activities within the scope of certification are occurring. So remember in the core requirement 1 scope, it's talking about having a list of all facilities that are within the scope of the certification here. And there may be some facilities that are doing like collection, or as Maya said, like retail stores or anything like that. So what are the specific legal requirements for those facilities as well? And what kind of controls, competence, and monitoring activities do you have in place? So the controls could be, you know, making sure that an annual report is filed, making sure that, you know, it's looked at during the monthly walkthrough, and defining the competence of the person who's in charge of the compliance program. What kind of experience do they need to have? So that should be somewhere in the compliance plan as well, to state that, you know, something like this used to be stated in the internal auditor competencies, and sometimes in the evaluation of compliance procedure. So this is specifically asking what's the competence of the personnel that you need to maintain compliance, and what kind of monitoring activities do you do aside from annual evaluation of compliance, or you might do it more frequently, you know. So, and there's other monitoring activities that might be important, such as a lot of places do monthly facility walkthroughs to kind of check compliance with their legal and other requirements.
Yeah, so monitoring activities can vary depending on the location, but they come in a variety of different ways that you would monitor facilities compliance, correct?
Yes. So it's up to the organization to determine what monitoring activities are appropriate to, during the time that they plan and implement their management system. And that might change as they go through the plan, do, check, act model, you know. They might see that they're missing some things, or that, you know, some stuff is too much. They're doing it too frequently, or if that's possible, you know.
Okay. Maya?
Yeah, actually, I do want to add something here, because it says, and all associated offsite locations where activities within the scope of certification are occurring. So one of the things, I mean, if we go back to provision 4 of R2 2013, this is something that we worked with our clients already in terms of identifying risks, environmental health and safety risks when it comes to their off-site location activities. But now this is also taking into consideration legal and other requirements for those activities that are happening there. So in terms of, like, for example, if somebody is, you know, if you're doing on data shredding on client site, then you really have to take into consideration what are the security risks there. So I'm actually reading this also, when you are performing work at a client site, then what are the legal and other requirements you have to be maintaining? And so maybe you're going to have a pre-processed checklist to make sure that, for example, if you're entering a confined space, depending what it is, right? If you're pulling out, or if you are decommissioning equipment and you have to go into a confined space, then maybe we need to take a look at what is the necessary personal protective equipment that needs to be put on, you know, glasses, and do you need to have reflective vest where you are? You need to interview with a client prior to going on site. What are the health and safety requirements before entering the site, and things like that. So this is something that I would encourage organizations to really take a look at, all of the processes that they're doing outside of their own facilities, whether it's on-site or off-site, but also take a look at the customer location processes.
Right, because if a client has a requirement that me as a contractor has to wear certain personal protective equipment when I'm on site, that becomes the requirement as well.
Correct. Right.
Okay.
And, you know, I mean, the way that you can go around this, it doesn't necessarily have to go onto your legal and other compliance listing yourself, because it's just so much to handle if you have, like, you know, thousands of customers. But the way to identify that is for every single, let's say, job, you're going to have a, I don't know, a job pre-checklist that's going to have a compliance requirement section. And that's the way that you're identifying it and reviewing it. When you're on site, you are initialing that you've done it, you know?
Mhm.
There are easy ways to manage this without, you know, listing all thousands of them on your list.
Right, yeah. Okay, good. Okay, so subsection C, import-export compliance. The plan shall also identify and document the applicable legal requirements of the exporting, transit, and importing countries to demonstrate the legality of all international shipments of 1, electronic equipment, components, and materials directly transferred by the R2 facility, and 2, R2 control streams, including shipments made by downstream vendors to final disposition and the first R2 facility.
It seems redundant for them to mention electronic equipment, components, and materials directly transferred by the R2 facility, and also R2 controlled streams. But I think the idea here is also we need to define R2 controlled streams.
Mhm.
So R2 controlled streams are basically the equipment, components, and materials that have focused material in them, or are focused materials, or are data bearing, or are equipment that is going for repair, refurbishment, anything like that that is controlled under the R2 standard. The stuff that would be considered a not controlled stream would be like white goods, like refrigerators or microwaves, or plastic, wood, metal, and stuff like that, that, you know, still has certain requirements. It's non-focused materials that need to be dealt with and handled properly, but the R2 controlled streams are those things that we need to really make sure are appropriately dealt with and managed in accordance with the legal and other requirements for shipping those materials.
Mhm.
So that I think that this is important to note, that they kind of enhance the import and export requirement by specifically kind of adding the R2 controlled stream, so it broadens it a little to define what the requirements are for the legality. I don't think it's much more, but it's just kind of going in accordance with the new standard, how it's written, and the way that it defines controlled streams as opposed to non-controlled streams of R2. I don't know if that made sense or if I went on way too long.
What about to the last part of the sentence, to final disposition or the first R2 facility?
Aha.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mike.
So I mean, this is the really the one of the benefits of the new of R2v3, right? Is that when the material gets to a R2 facility, you can show that it's a R2 facility. The downstream due diligence stops there. So before, you have to document the legality of all international shipments to end of life, regardless of whether or not it is going to a R2 facility or not. But now these R2 controlled streams and electronic equipment and components can stop when they either get to final disposition or the first R2 facility.
Mhm.
So I think it's important to define what the legal import-export requirements are, but it's also there's less due diligence that is necessary under R2v3. It gives you the benefit of working with downstream vendors that are R2 certified.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maya?
Mike is right about this. Yeah. So
Okay.
I have nothing to add to this one. It's pretty good.
Okay, good. Okay, so now we're on subsection D, monitoring compliance. So I'm going to read every supersection separately. The R2 facility shall identify and implement the actions and controls required to ensure compliance with all requirements.
So I think that identify is the list,
Mhm.
and implement meaning just be reviewing it and adding to it as needed.
Okay. The R2 facility shall maintain the legal compliance plan consistent with changes in the requirements and the FM management plan.
Again, same, maintain legal compliance plan. You should probably have a process or procedure, or some kind of a compliance calendar, right? Consistent with changes in the requirements. So again, make sure that you are updating it as needed based on what you need to update. And the FM management plan, again, you have to have a focused materials management plan and be updating it as needed, given that whether your activities are changing or legal and other requirements, whether domestic or international, changing.
Right. Okay. The R2 facility shall periodically audit its compliance with legal requirements by a competent auditor knowledgeable in the operations and applicable requirements.
Again, this too is kind of what we've already been doing, right? If you have R2 certification already, and if you don't, you just simply need to audit your compliance periodically. It doesn't say that it has to be done quarterly or twice a year or yearly, but certification bodies as well as series intending for this to be done on at least on a yearly basis. Mm-hmm. And the change here is specifically says, you know, your compliance auditor has to have, it has to be competent, right, in the operation and the applicable requirements. So hopefully you have somebody who is familiar with the recycling industry, who is doing your compliance review, as well as has a background in the requirements themselves.
Mm-hmm. The R2 facility shall take corrective action to promptly stop and resolve any issues of non-compliance.
So this, again, a corrective action. So take corrective action, meaning you have to issue a corrective action, or you have to have some kind of a incident reporting, and address them in, you know, in a timely manner. So you can't sit on them. So I think this is very straightforward.
Yeah. Okay. The R2 facility shall notify the certification body within 30 days of receiving any regulatory order or notice of violation that requires any action to address the violation and follow up with the issuing agency.
So this is a new requirement. Mm-hmm. So if you have a citation, you have to notify your certification body and keep them up on, you know, whatever the status of that is.
Right. So, right. And I'm sure it's a case-by-case basis, but we need to point out, I think, that it's a regulatory order or notice of violation that requires any action to address the violation. So if there's a fine or a request for correction, if there's something that the corporate R2 facility has to do, then that becomes a reporting incident.
Right. That's how I'm reading this. Right. But if it's just like for example, if you have an inspection and it's just an observation, then I don't think you have to report it unless it is full-on non-conformity, non-compliance.
Yeah. Mike, anything to add to that section?
No, I think that's right. I think you guys dissected it there.
Okay. So on to subsection E, child and forced labor. An R2 facility shall not use child labor as defined by the International Labor Organization or forced labor where the worker cannot leave or terminate employment freely.
So this is definitely a new requirement. All of E, F, and G are new requirements. Mm-hmm. And then it gives specific guidelines of the International Labor Organization. So then I think that should be something that is added in your compliance plan, because you have to know what the requirements are to know whether or not this is being met, right?
Mm-hmm. So let me read this section on prison labor too, since it's very closely related. The use of prisoners is only acceptable if it is voluntary, compensated beyond a room and board, and skills are taught for gainful employment after release.
So you just have to pay prisoners.
Right, right. Okay.
And teach them a skill.
Mhm.
Right. So,
Like Unicor does, I believe, has prison programs where they're paying their prisoners for that and then giving them skills. And a lot of recyclers are pretty good. Even some recyclers have the motto, "We recycle people," because they hire or employ people who have come from prison backgrounds, and they have certain skills that they've learned either in prison or elsewhere, and they want to make sure that these type of people have the opportunity to have gainful employment after release.
Yes. Subsection G, non-discrimination policy. An R2 facility shall document a non-discrimination policy stating the fair and equal treatment of all workers, regardless of aspects such as, but not limited to, age, gender, race, religion, or sexual orientation, including compensation in compliance with applicable wage laws. The policy shall define the process to report, investigate, and respond to discrimination complaints, and shall be periodically communicated to all staff.
I think a lot of this stuff, at least in the U.S., is probably
It's codified.
already in law. It's codified in the employment law. So I don't think that this is something that companies already had to probably comply with all of these things here. I don't really know that much about employment law, so I can't speak to that specifically. But so this is definitely a new requirement that they're specifically adding this. So that's something to add to the compliance plan too, to make sure that these things are being complied with.
Mm-hmm. Right, and the periodic communication as well.
Yes.
Maya, anything to add to this section?
No, this is just the only thing is, so if you're United States, you might want to add this to your legal and other requirements in terms of what is the letter of the law there, and the link to it, and so to make sure that you're complying with it. But probably your HR already is making sure you're complying with it.
Right. Yeah. And I think this is probably going to affect kind of the smaller companies who fall outside the scope of some of the OSHA requirements. So now we kind of bump up our compliance a little bit with the small size companies. Okay. Well, that any final thoughts on legal and other requirements?
The only thing I would say, I obviously depending on, how long you've had the certificate, if you are transitioning from R2 2013 to R2v3, if you have already had the certification for a significant amount of time, you probably do all of this already, with the exception of the prison labor and child labor, and maybe your non-discrimination policy and process is not part of it. But I think you're already meeting all of those requirements, and it's just going to be like an extra step to make sure that you're dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's. And if you're new to R2v3, then this might really surprise, to R2 certification, this might really shake you up, especially if you're a smaller organization, because you're going to have to sit down and identify all of the legal and other requirements that you haven't thought of before. And it's this section that might trigger a lot of additional expenses. Again, depending where you are, what you're doing, what your scope is, whether you own the facility or don't own the facility. So really, this is where it's going, most of the additional hidden costs to certification might be coming from. Yeah,
I agree. Okay, well, thank you for joining us on our R2 read-along. If you have any questions regarding this core requirement or any of the other requirements, please email us at info@glenviewgroup.com. And we will see you next time where we talk about core requirement number 5, tracking throughput.
Yes, thank you. Bye.